February 1945, Birmingham, England. A cold wind cut through the hangar doors as Major Charity Adams stepped inside for the first time. The space stretched before her like a canyon of shadows and silence. Mountains of canvas sacks rose floor to ceiling. Some toppled and spilling their contents across oil-stained concrete. 17 million pieces of mail, letters, packages, Christmas cards sent months ago, all waiting in the dark. The smell was damp paper and metal and neglect. Charity's fingers, already numb from the cold, curled inside her gloves. She looked at the women standing behind her, 855 black women in army uniforms, watching her face for a signal. They had crossed an ocean to get here. They had been told this backlog would take 6 months to clear. She knew they had less time than that, and less room for error. She thought of her father's words before she left. "They'll be watching you to fail." This is the story of Charity Adams Earley and the women of the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, the only all-black, all-female unit deployed overseas during World War II. While men fought on the front lines, these women fought a different battle against chaos, inefficiency, racism, and the quiet erasure of their labor. They never fired a weapon. They sorted mail, but in doing so, they held together the morale of an entire army at war. History barely remembers their names. This is why that silence is unforgivable. Charity Adams was born in 1918 in Columbia, South Carolina, and grew up in Hickory, Ohio, the daughter of a minister and a schoolteacher. She was a quiet child who loved reading and order. Her teachers noticed her discipline early. By the time she graduated from Wilberforce University in 1938, she had already learned what it meant to move through a world that expected little from black women and punished them for excelling anyway. She became a teacher. She taught math to children who had never been told they were capable of it. She was good at it. But when the war came, she wanted to do more. In 1942, she joined the newly formed Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. She was one of the first black women to enlist. She did not imagine herself a hero. She imagined herself useful. That was all she wanted, to be of use in a moment when the world was tearing itself apart. The Army did not know what to do with her. Women were nurses or clerks or typists. Black women, especially, were kept far from anything that resembled command. But Charity was sharp, disciplined, and unshakable. Her superiors noticed. By 1944, she was promoted to major, the first black woman to reach that rank in the Women's Army Corps. It was an honor that came with a warning: do not embarrass us. The war in Europe was grinding into its final year. Soldiers were scattered across England, France, Belgium, and Germany. They were cold, exhausted, and homesick. The only thing that kept many of them sane was the hope of a letter from home. A word from a wife, a mother, a sweetheart, a child. But the postal system had collapsed under the weight of war. Mail piled up in warehouses and hangars, unsorted, undelivered, some of it 2 years old. Men wrote letters that never arrived. Families sent packages that vanished. Morale was crumbling. The Army knew this. They needed a solution. They decided to send the 6888 Battalion. The battalion was formed in early 1945. 855 black women, recruited from across the United States, trained in basic postal directory procedures and military discipline. Most had never been overseas. Many had never been farther than the nearest city. They were teachers, students, clerks, factory workers. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they wore the uniform. They took the oath. And they boarded a ship bound for England in February 1945, knowing they were walking into something no one believed they could finish. Charity was their commanding officer. She was 26 years old. She had never led anything larger than a classroom. Now she was responsible for nearly 900 women in a foreign country, working under conditions the Army itself had deemed impossible. She knew what was expected, that she would fail, that her women would fail, and that their failure would be used as proof that black women had no place in the military. She did not intend to give them that satisfaction. The hangar in Birmingham was worse than anyone had described. The lights were dim, flickering bulbs that barely cut through the gloom. There was no heat. The building was a converted airplane repair facility, vast and drafty, with broken windows and a leaking roof. The mail sacks were piled so high in some areas that you could not see the back wall. Many of the letters had been damaged by moisture or rodents. Addresses were smudged, names were misspelled. Soldiers moved frequently, so old addresses were useless. Some men had died, and no one had marked their records. The task was not just sorting, it was detective work, and it had to be done fast. Charity divided her battalion into 3 shifts working around the clock. She instituted a system. First, sort by theater of operation, then by division, then by unit, then by name. If a name was incomplete or illegible, cross-reference it with personnel rosters. If a soldier had transferred or been killed, reroute the mail to next of kin. Every piece of mail was a puzzle. Every puzzle had a human being on the other end, waiting. Her women worked with ink-stained fingers and aching backs. That same ink kept darkening her fingertips, turning into a quiet badge of the hours she refused to surrender. The cold seeped into their bones. Some developed frostbite. Others caught pneumonia. But they kept going. Charity walked the floor every night, checking on them, answering questions, solving problems. She did not sleep much. She could not afford to. The work was relentless, and so were the people watching them fail. They had 6 months to clear the backlog. Charity decided they would do it in 3. She believed the hardest battles were behind them, but a far greater test was already on its way. The racism was constant. White officers questioned her authority. They referred to her as girl or ignored her rank. Local British townspeople were startled to see black women in uniform. Some refused to serve them in pubs or shops. Charity absorbed it all with a face like stone. She did not shout. She did not beg. She simply made it clear that her battalion would operate with discipline, efficiency, and excellence, and that anyone who interfered would answer to her. Once a white colonel tried to inspect her unit unannounced, implying that black women could not be trusted to work unsupervised. Charity met him at the door. She told him he could observe from a distance, but he would not disrupt her operation. He left. The story spread. Her women felt something shift. They had a leader who would not bend. She knew this moment would define them all. The work settled into a relentless rhythm that blurred hours, days, and even hope. Hands moving through piles, eyes scanning names, voices calling out corrections, the sound of typewriters clacking in the cold. Charity moved between the rows, her uniform crisp despite the grime, her voice steady when someone made a mistake. She did not tolerate laziness, but she understood exhaustion. She rotated shifts carefully, gave women breaks when they needed them, celebrated small victories. A particularly difficult address solved, a long-lost package finally sent home. The women began to see the work differently. It was not just mail. It was a lifeline. It was proof that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to write. By the second month, time became their fiercest enemy. 3 months in, they had processed over 10 million pieces of mail. The backlog was shrinking. Word spread through the ranks. The women of the 6888th were actually doing it. Soldiers began receiving letters they had given up on. Families got Christmas packages in March. A father learned his son was alive. A wife learned hers was not. The emotional weight of it all pressed down on Charity's shoulders, but she did not let it show. She kept her ink-stained fingers moving, but the pressure was building in other ways. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The celebrations were loud and joyful. But for Charity and her battalion, the work was not finished. They were transferred to Rouen, France, then to Paris, to handle the mail backlog there. The conditions were better, warmer buildings, more resources, but the scrutiny was worse. She expected relief in France. Instead, she stepped into a pressure that threatened to break everything they had built. Now that the war was won, people wanted to know, what had these black women really contributed? Were they necessary? Could they be sent home and forgotten? Charity knew the answer they wanted. She also knew the answer she would give. Her battalion had processed 17 million pieces of mail in record time. With fewer errors than any other postal unit in the European theater, they had worked faster, smarter, and more efficiently than anyone believed possible. They had done this while enduring segregation, disrespect, and the constant assumption that they were not good enough. They had done this with no recognition, no parade, no place in the headlines. They had done it because it needed to be done. In November 1945, the 6888 returned to the United States. There was no ticker tape parade, no medal ceremony. The newspapers barely mentioned them. Most Americans did not know they had existed. The women were discharged quietly, sent back to their hometowns, told to resume their lives as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Charity Adams went back to Ohio. She married. She earned a master's degree. She worked in education and administration. She did not talk much about the war. Sometimes, when she opened a letter at home, she noticed the faint memory of ink on her skin and felt the cold of that Birmingham hangar all over again. When people asked, she said she had served. She did not say how or why it mattered. The reasons for the erasure were many. They were women, so their service was considered auxiliary. They were black, so their contributions were minimized or ignored. They had not fired weapons or stormed beaches, so their work was deemed less heroic. The Army did not want to highlight the success of a segregated unit. It complicated the narrative of integration and progress. Archives were incomplete. Records were lost. The women themselves, conditioned by a lifetime of being overlooked, did not always speak up, and so the story disappeared into silence. But history has a way of surfacing. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians began to uncover the 6,888th story. Veterans of the battalion started sharing their memories. Documentaries were made. Books were written. In 2019, a monument was planned. In 2022, Congress awarded the unit the Congressional Gold Medal 77 years after their service. Charity Adams Earley died in 2002. She was 83. She lived long enough to see some recognition, but not nearly enough. Charity Adams Earley led with quiet authority in a world that did not want her to lead at all. She took a battalion of women no one believed in and turned them into the most efficient postal unit in the European theater. She did this without weapons, without glory, without the recognition that should have been hers from the start. Her ink-stained fingers moved through millions of names, each one a life she was helping to hold together. She knew her work mattered. She also knew it would be forgotten. The women of the 6,888th sorted mail in freezing hangars, while history looked the other way. They endured racism, exhaustion, and invisibility. They kept the Army connected when connection was all that soldiers had left. And when the war ended, they went home to silence. How many other lives like theirs slip into silence before anyone even thinks to ask their names?